very dramatically waiting for the ending of the bells. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Wow, great to see a full house. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Cole Wagner, who is a parishioner of St. Thomas. He is also a historic research specialist at Robert Stern Architects. He studied architectural history and construction at Columbia University and the Bartlett School at UCL, and previously worked for Barry Bergdahl, professor of architectural history at Columbia and the former curator of design at MoMA. He currently lives in Morningside Heights, and as I said, is a parishioner of our church. He will be doing a brief presentation, after which there will be a period for Q&A, so if you have any questions, please do save them. And without further ado, I introduce Cole.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome to this lecture on notable Episcopal churches in New York. Through our parent, the Church of England, we are in fact the second oldest Christian practice on the island of Manhattan after the Dutch Reformed Church. Since the first Anglican parish began in 1697, several hundred Episcopalian buildings have been raised within New York's expanding boundaries of many different shapes, sizes, and styles. It would be entirely too big a task in the 45 minutes we have together to deliver an exhaustive history of Episcopalian church building in the diocese. Instead, I've chosen a selection of buildings that serve as landmarks in both the history of Episcopalianism and church building itself in New York. This lecture will cover 11 churches. First, a group of 3 that are some of the earliest religious buildings in New York. Then we will go uptown and into the Gothic Revival movement, which became popular throughout the British Empire and the United States during the middle of the 19th century. We will then take a look at the 3 great Episcopalian monuments in the city designed by Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, and conclude with the dramatic story of the construction of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Through it all, wherever possible, I have sought to use drawings and prints from as close to the time of construction as possible, and have mostly succeeded. I hope you find this look at the past, in the past, as interesting as I have. Trinity Church is the oldest Anglican parish in the city. The permissions for its construction were granted by King William III in 1698, an ironic situation to those with a knowledge of English history. England's first Dutch king starts the first English church in the colony the English stole from the Dutch. Raising the building was a collective effort from many individuals of the colony. One of the most notable names on the donation list is the infamous pirate William Kidd. The completed church spire became a key landmark for sailors and is the beginning of New York's skyline. Queen Anne expanded Trinity's holdings in 1702, granting the parish 215 acres of land to rent or farm. This land grant secured the church an income and a future. Over the years, the parish's activities grew. A charity school was founded in 1709, the building was expanded in 1727, and King's College, affiliated with Trinity, was granted its charter by King George III in 1754. However, its central location turned out to be its downfall during the American Revolution, when, over the course of the Battle of New York, it burned down along with 500 other buildings in Manhattan on September 20, 1776. These tensions were reflected in the composition of its ministry. The patriot Samuel Prevost was turfed out of his position by the British, while loyalist Charles Inglis met the same fate in 1783. Ultimately, Prevost was made rector in 1787, around the time the Episcopal Church formally ratified its break with the Church of England. The new Trinity Church was completed in 1790, a year too late to provide services to the newly inaugurated President George Washington, who, after taking the oath of office in Federal Hall, attended services at St. Paul's Chapel on April 30, 1788. St. Paul's Chapel began as, and still is, a satellite entity of Trinity Church and was completed in 1766. Its central core was designed by architect Thomas McBean, an émigré from Scotland, and is the oldest extant church in New York City, as well as the longest functioning public building. St. Paul's design belongs to the Anglo-Palladian tradition of architecture. This was pioneered by another Scottish architect, James Gibbs, who was McBean's tutor. His design for the London Church of St. Martin in the Fields, completed in 1726, was a groundbreaking building in its own right and a prototype for Anglican churches both in the UK and around the Empire, especially in North America. Churches designed in this tradition are based on the classical buildings of the Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio and are the precedents for many notable early American buildings. More than just a style, however, the temple plan and layout is oriented toward the pulpit, which reflected the emphasis on sermons that 18th century Anglican services were focused on. To distinguish the building from its pagan temple ancestors, however, the steeple was added, which both referenced older Christian buildings as well as provided an orientating landmark and clock for the community. However, the connections to medieval Christianity end there. 18th century Anglicanism was dogmatically anti-Catholic, and all ornament, decoration, and sculpture were expunged from the buildings in favor of secular coats of arms. The steeple itself was crowned not with a cross, but with a weather vane. St. Paul's Chapel belongs to this tradition of church building, but with some notable twists. First, the Ionic columns of the portico and the spire were added in 1794 by James C. Lawrence. Second, the portico itself is not attached to the entrance at the west end, but instead on the east, opposite the steeple, in order to create an architectural statement on Broadway. The interior continues looking back at London. Its grandly classical Corinthian columns are almost a direct quotation of the design of St. Martin in the Fields. It also features 14 Waterford crystal chandeliers. In 1950, St. Paul's was restored to its full colonial appearance, one of the earliest such projects in New York. More recently, St. Paul's became nationally known for being a center for relief for rescue workers during 9/11. A large sycamore tree absorbed most of the debris that headed its way, preserving the building from damage, and the church was put to use as a relief station, providing food, shelter, and a resting station for the first responders on site. The next and final Georgian church we will look at is St. Mark's in the Bowery. St. Mark's was completed in 1799 and was sited where the 1660 chapel of the Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant used to be. Stuyvesant is still interred in the crypt underneath the building today. In 1793, Stuyvesant's grandson, Peter, sold the plot of land to the Episcopal Church for $1, with the stipulation that a church be erected to serve on the small community of Bowery Town that had sprung up around their compound. The new church was designed by John McComb Jr., an architect and mason. Between 1790 and 1825, he was New York's leading architect. Other notable works include Gracie Mansion, Alexander Hamilton's house, Hamilton Grange, and New York City Hall. Hamilton himself provided legal services for the new parish, the first in New York City, independent of Trinity. St. Mark's received its own Greek Revival steeple in 1828 from the architects Martin Euclid Thompson and Ithiel Town. The church received another makeover in 1836 when the original square pillars of the building were replaced with ones in the Egyptian Revival style. The late 1830s also saw the addition of the cast iron fence that currently runs around the property, as well as the Sunday school. Later on in the 1860s, the great Gothic designer James Renwick Jr., an architect we shall meet many times in this lecture, added the brick addition to the parish hall. The cast iron portico was added in 1858 by the inventor James Bogardus, who had patented a method of creating cast iron architecture in 1850. The 20th century saw the addition of a rectory by Ernest Flagg, but most construction stopped in favor of other pursuits. Thanks to the initiative of a notable rector of the parish, William Guthrie, whose services at St. Mark's became quite unorthodox. Notable liturgical additions included interpretive dancing and rock and roll. However, the community had to turn their attention back to the building when a fire consumed the structure in 1978. To respond to the devastation, the community formed the organization the Friends of St. Mark's to raise money for the restoration, completed 5 years later. At this point, we are now going to mark a radical shift in church building style that reflected a change in the liturgical attitude of the Episcopal Church. The Anglo-Catholic movement began in England at Oxford in the 1820s and rapidly gained popularity through the efforts of preachers and architects like A.W.N. Pugin, who advocated for a return to Gothic as a more physically Christian style of architecture, as opposed to pagan classicism and the polluting factories of industrial England. The movement first made its way to New York architecturally in the 1840s with the erection of the Second Grace Church. Grace Church was founded in 1808 in the financial district. Like our own parish, it followed the migration of genteel New York society up the island in the middle of the 19th century. The design for Grace Church was the first major commission of one of the two great stars of 19th century American Gothic architecture, James Renwick Jr. He designed the main body of the church when he was just 25 years old, beginning a career of Gothic Revival buildings whose highlights include the Smithsonian Museum building in Washington, D.C., and St. Patrick's Cathedral just down the street. The sanctuary and the rectory were completed in 1847 in a more reserved original form from the one we know today. After its completion, the church rose in popularity exponentially and quickly developed a reputation as one of the most fashionable parishes in New York. The cultural observer Matthew Hale Smith wrote in 1869 that to be married or buried within its walls has ever been considered the height of felicity. It began with a wooden spire, but the notable Episcopal clergyman Henry Codman Potter, a character we shall encounter later, who was rector of Grace Church at the time, had it replaced with a marble one designed by Renwick in 1881. Further extensions to the church grounds includes a clergy house by Hines and Lafarge, who we will also spend a great deal of time with, completed in 1903, and a neighborhood house for community events by Renwick's successor, J. Lawrence Aspinwall, completed in 1907. The parish also built a number of subsidiary chapels around Lower Manhattan. The only extant building currently standing was built in 1896 as the Grace Chapel and Hospital on East 14th Street. The complex was designed by the public building firm of Barney and Chapman in a matching French Gothic style, complete with a bridge to bring patients from the hospital over into the church for services. The chapel was sold to the Roman Catholic Church in 1946, who currently operate the facility as the Church of the Immaculate Conception and Clergy House. Calvary Church has a very similar story. Its parish was founded in 1836 on what was then a rural area of 4th Avenue and is now Park Avenue and 30th Street in a small wooden chapel. This chapel moved south to its present site in 1842, and Renwick Jr. built another Gothic building, completed in 1848. Unfortunately, its wooden spires rotted and were cut away in 1860, leaving just the octagonal bases below. The church remained this way through the turn of the century, when it was romantically depicted by the Impressionist painter Frederick Childe Hassam. In 1929, even those became unstable and were dismantled as well. Calvary is a unique case architecturally. Most of the time, as we will see later, ambitious designs don't get built as high as they could be. In this case, the building went up, but then was reduced in size over time. Calvary is also noted for a very high caliber of attendees. Notable parishioners include the 21st President, Chester A. Arthur, John Jacob Astor III, and Eleanor Roosevelt. The Reverend Samuel Shoemaker was Calvary's minister between 1925 and 1952, and was critical in founding Alcoholics Anonymous. The third mid-century Gothic Revival church we will now cover is the Third Trinity Church by Richard Upjohn, completed in 1846. We left Trinity Church back in 1788 in its second iteration, repaired after the burning of New York and frequented by American notables such as John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington himself. However, severe snowstorms fatally weakened the roof in the winter of 1838-1839, and the building was torn down shortly afterward. To design the new church, the English architect Richard Upjohn, later to design St. Thomas's first church on Fifth Avenue and the predecessor to the building we're in now, was retained for a commission that would define his career. Styled in English Gothic and executed in New York brownstone, the building's facade and massing is oriented around its spire. Double buttressing at each corner recedes into the tower as it rises, conveying both solidity and height. The spire, like its predecessor, defined New York's skyline. At 281 feet tall, it held the title of tallest building in the United States until 1869, when St. Michael's Church in Old Town, Chicago, surpassed it. Trinity would hold on to the New York record for another 21 years until the New York World Building was completed in 1890. Trinity was recently the subject of a full restoration campaign designed to both address decades of deferred maintenance, amend less thoughtful interventions in previous years, and bring the building into compliance with accessibility codes. To do this, the restoration firm MBB Architects developed a phased plan that first gutted and then systematically pieced back together almost the entire building. Architecture and ornament were cleaned, new clerestory windows were installed, interior and exterior lighting and audiovisual systems were updated, and vestry, sacristy, and choir rooms were added and reimagined. Finally, an entirely new bluestone terrace wraps around the back of the church, facilitating accessibility. A new loggia, made of brownstone, just like the main body of the building, houses a stair at the northwest entrance. This was supplemented by a freestanding canopy with color-matched steel supporting glass panels that allow liturgical processions to proceed outside. These interventions, along with all other work on the church, had to be approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, reflecting its complex and powerful role in shaping New York's heritage buildings. The next mid-century parish church we will look at is the quaint and idyllic Church of the Transfiguration, or the Little Church around the corner on East 29th Street. The congregation was founded in 1848, and the main building was completed a year later by an unknown architect. Unlike the previous churches we have been looking at so far, which have generally had very well-heeled and high society parishioners, the Little Church has always been a more bohemian and less formal institution. The church building is set back from the street within a garden, creating an intimate and picturesque facsimile of the English countryside. The Guildhall, transepts, and tower were added in 1852. This parish is very strongly connected to the theater community. An apocryphal story has the rector of a nearby church refusing to conduct the funeral services on account of the deceased having been an actor, not a prestigious occupation in those days, and suggesting to the man's friend to find the little church around the corner where they do that sort of thing. This derisive dismissal rapidly became a point of pride for the parish and resulted in the Episcopal Actors Guild being organized there in 1923. The covered Lich Gate, or Resurrection Gate, was added in 1896 by the English architect Frederick Clark Withers, who had a significant role in introducing high Victorian Gothic architecture to the United States. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin is one of many averagely sized Episcopalian churches constructed in the latter half of the 19th century, but it is notable both for its strong Anglo-Catholic orientation and its innovative structure. The founder of the congregation, Thomas McKee Brown, was a devoted adherent of Tractarianism by the time he was ordained in 1866. Naturally, when he was asked to establish a church in Longacre Square, the previous name for Times Square, which changed in 1904 with the construction of the Times building, he had a church built that reflected his faith. A cornerstone was laid at 228 West 45th Street in 1868, and the small church, designed by an architect named William T. Hallett, was completed in 1870. You can see his Catholic focus is manifested in the building. Look at all the triangular elements meant to reference the Trinity. By 1890, this congregation had outgrown the smaller building. Luckily, one very generous Miss Sarah Cook left over $700,000 to the church, enabling the purchase of 8 lots between 46th and 47th Streets. The architect hired was Pierre Lebrun of the firm Napoleon Lebrun and Sons. Napoleon Lebrun was a major Philadelphia church architect who moved to New York in 1864 after designing the Cathedral Basilica of St. Peter and Paul. Partnering with his sons, their firm became a force in ecclesiastical and municipal architecture, designing over 40 buildings for the fire department. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin had 2 design stipulations beyond the requests for the usual nave, rectory, clergy house, and mission. 1, that the new building seat 800, and 2, that the interior be lofty. In order to accommodate these requirements on the narrow lot, Lebrun decided that the structure of the church was to be steel as opposed to stone. This let the church fit into the narrow space provided by the lots with a structural frame supporting the vaulting and the walls. Like its predecessor, the visuals of the church is meant to emphasize pre-Reformation Catholicism. Its front facade is very French Gothic in both detail and composition. The nave, 80 feet tall from floor to ceiling and 46 feet wide, also features side aisles, an ambulatory, a deep chancel, and ancillary chapels, all further architecturally referencing this orientation. The sculptural program of the church also reflects this. John Massey Rind, a Scottish sculptor who trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed the troupeau and tympanum programs to reflect the liturgy. Finally, a further clue came from the services themselves. The church became known as Smoky Mary's, thanks to the copious amounts of incense burned for each Mass. Now, at this point, we will move all the way uptown, away from the tightly packed financial district and the gilded splendor of Broadway, to the northern end of New York City, Washington Heights. During the early and mid-19th century, wealthy New Yorkers established their estates here. John James Audubon, who loathed Manhattan's busy areas, was one of them. The vestry of Trinity Church also saw the potential of the area. They purchased the land around which the church currently sits as their parish cemetery. Many of New York's most notable individuals, Astors, Skimmerhorns, and other luminaries of the 19th century are buried there. However, there were no facilities for the living, and in 1846, Audubon, along with several other Heights locals, put together a small parish that met in a neighbor's front parlor. A year later, a small Victorian Gothic church was raised on the current site. Later in the 19th century, a stone building by Rembrandt Lockwood went up. However, the parish was financially mismanaged, and by 1903 had been declared insolvent. The sheriff took possession of the building, and things were looking grim, until the new pastor, the charismatic Reverend Milo H. Gates, took charge, who arranged for the Church of the Intercession to formally affiliate itself with Trinity. As part of Gates' plan to reinvigorate the parish, a new church was commissioned, in large part thanks to the massive boost in congregants he brought in. At the peak of his tenure, Intercession had 3,500 worshippers. For the new chapel, the vestry at Trinity commissioned the same firm St. Thomas did, Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson. Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, who had done similar churches up and down the East Coast, took on the project personally. Goodhue built the church on a grand scale. It is 200 feet long, 81 feet high, and has a width of 70 feet. Notably, compared to our building's primarily French precedents, it is built in a very English style of Gothic. Its narrow and tall entrance provokes the English perpendicular, and the tower is a suggestion of the Tudor style. On the inside, the decorated period of English Gothic design can be seen in the tracery. The altarpiece is a notable feature of intercession and again echoes another component of our church. The altar is covered with 1,500 stone pieces from sacred sites and churches around the world, including Jericho, Mount Sinai, the Wailing Wall, and Canterbury Cathedral. The Church of the Intercession's most notable space is its crypt, however. Quadriptite vaulting supports the church above and houses what is claimed to be the first columbarium in a church for parishioners' ashes. It also serves as the final resting place of Goodhue himself. Goodhue believed his church was his finest work and asked to be buried here. His longtime collaborator Lee Laurie sculpted his tomb, creating an effigy of him in the spirit of the royal tombs of the French kings at the Basilique de Saint-Denis in Paris, the first truly Gothic building. Laurie also included a relief of Goodhue's most notable structures across the arched bay above. Now, we will turn our attention to our rival on Park Avenue, St. Bartholomew's Church. Like us, it began in the first half of the 19th century downtown at Great Jones Street and Lafayette Place in 1835. By 1872, the congregation, also like our own, had both expanded and moved north, so St. Bart's commissioned this church on land originally owned by William Vanderbilt at Madison Avenue and 44th Street, another design by James Renwick Jr. It was completed in 1876. In 1903, Stanford White of the prestigious firm McKim, Mead & White designed a triple portal entry based on the facade of the Abbey of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in Provence, which he believed to be the most beautiful abbey in France. The Vanderbilt family paid for it as a memorial to William. Unfortunately, this building suffered from severe structural issues. Over the decades, it had settled extremely poorly, leading to the roof being compromised by 1914. The church decided to take advantage of this situation as an opportunity to move again, as well as create a space capable of handling a large congregation. For an architect for the new building, they originally did consider McKim, Mead & White, but because they wanted the new church to be built around the portal, which would be moved uptown. However, White had died in 1906, so they did decide to turn to Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue. Goodhue, now well known in New York thanks to his designs for St. Thomas and freshly out of his partnership with Ralph Adams Cram, moved quickly to secure the design, even promising a Romanesque style that did not play to his Gothic strengths. He knew the portal was going to be the centerpiece of the new church and prepared his designs accordingly. In July 1914, only 5 months after St. Bart's made the decision to move, Goodhue had come up with a scheme that referenced the plan of the Basilica of St. Mark's in Venice and the elevation of Westminster Cathedral in London, with masonry of red brick and stone that references the Romanesque churches of northern Italy. This choice of styling was prompted by the plan, which called for no pews in the side aisles and as many as possible in the crossing and the transept. This meant that it needed style precedents that had less emphasis on length, such as the Byzantine. Another change that was called for by the requirements of the building was the switch to mosaic decorations. Barrel vaulting covered in mosaics were chosen because the rich detailing of Gothic, or even early Romanesque sculpture, would capture too much of the spoken voice, which would disappear into the details. Unfortunately, the construction process was fraught with controversy. The parish was torn over whether to sell part of the plot to a developer in order to raise money. This option was initially favored by the vestry, but quickly reversed. The selection of a proposal that took up this full site, along with a sudden commitment to a program of detailing that included lavish applications of marble and stonework, meant that costs were extremely high. This led to conflict between Goodhue and the vestry. Goodhue had lowballed the costs, which was held against him, but the vestry, in looking for so much decoration, was trying to have its cake and eat it too. Eventually, through many painful negotiations and the commitment of the parish to raise the funds needed to realize an acceptable design, the building proceeded. The main structure of the building, kept deliberately simple, was completed in 1917, but costs kept climbing. This meant that many of the fine materials and stonework had to be reduced in scope and scale, and what could happen would proceed bit by bit over the next decade. Work fully stopped between 1919 and 1921. This slow pace meant that Goodhue, who died in 1924, did not live to see his church fully realized. This left St. Bart's with the problem of the community house, which had not been fully designed. Goodhue's associates made the decision to proceed using the same exterior cladding and a simplified ornamental scheme to match the main building with a simplified massing. Goodhue's longtime collaborator, the sculptor Lee Laurie, did much of the interior work, and while the designs were worked out after Goodhue's death, it is assumed his general intention was preserved. All in all, it was not until 1930 that St. Bartholomew's Church was completed in its entirety. Despite all the conflicts, the building realized was a marvel. While it did not adhere to any clear style in the way that St. Thomas is a direct descendant of the great French Gothic cathedrals, it accomplished its goal of housing its congregation in a new, bold building that displayed a distinct character. A next chapter in St. Bartholomew's history came much later in the 1980s, when the rector of the time, Thomas Bowers, sought to sell off the community house to a developer for a tall office building in order to fund outreach efforts and charity, echoing the previous debate. St. Bart's had been made a New York City landmark in 1967 against the church's wishes. This was common at the time. Rectors wanted the flexibility to make decisions about how best to serve their parishes, but local communities wanted to make sure their buildings were preserved. A number of the concerned members of the vestry wound up splitting off from St. Bart's and forming a committee to protect the church. In 1981, the notable modernist architect Edward Durrell Stone proposed a 59-story design for the community house site, which the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and the Committee to Save St. Bartholomew's responded to with a lawsuit, kicking off the Battle of St. Bart's. It was a major conflict and defined preservation law in New York City. It even got a book published about it, I'm Waiting for the Blockbuster. Despite Stone proposing a shorter and much more sympathetic tower in 1985, the plan met strenuous opposition, which was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court. In 1991, the court declined to hear the church's appeal of the second court decision in favor of the LPC, ending the battle. The struggle severely depleted St. Bartholomew's financial resources, and the tense atmosphere caused by the litigation also drove away many members. Luckily, since then, St. Bart's has returned to its position as one of the great Episcopalian congregations. A $20 million restoration campaign was mounted to undertake a comprehensive restoration of the building, which had water trouble. While this was underway, St. Bartholomew's Church and the community's house was designated a national landmark in 2016, ensuring the safety of the entire site. Goodhue's final Episcopal building was the Church of the Heavenly Rest on 5th Avenue and 90th Street. This parish began relatively late, at least compared to the other storied congregations we have been looking at over the course of this lecture. A group of returning Civil War veterans came together in 1865 and put up their first church in 1871, a Victorian Gothic structure by Edward T. Potter, who was a student of Richard Upjohn. Its central sanctuary was set well back from the street front, and its portal was barely wider than a brownstone, prompting the observation, "I see the heavenly, but where's the rest?" When the congregation merged with the Church of the Beloved Disciple in 1924, they acquired a new site for their churches at 1085 Fifth Avenue from Andrew Carnegie's widow, Louise, who lived across the street in a mansion that is now the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Louise sold them the plot with one stipulation: so as not to obscure her garden's view, the church would be no more than 75 feet tall. This meant that the building would not be able to take part in the Gothic style's most distinctive feature, the height added by towers and spires. Robert A.M. Stern characterized this as playing into the building's character, however, saying that the trumpeting angles at the tower's corners, combined with the cresting and flamboyant traceries of the west fainted pointed arch window, conspire to make the building seem at once modern, medieval, and distinctly French. The project began under Goodhue's pencil, but he passed away the year the church was commissioned. The work was taken up by Hardy Phillip, one of Goodhue's key associates, who is responsible for bringing the building to its dedication in 1929. At the time of his death, Goodhue had been moving away from Gothic, as we saw at St. Bart's. His design for the state capital of Nebraska reflects his burgeoning interest in the Art Deco movement and a more streamlined style of architecture. In his epitaph, colleagues commented that if he had lived longer, he would have created even more minimalist designs. The Church of the Heavenly Rest is a preview of what might have been. The church is notable for its sculptural program, which is characterized as being in the Gothic Deco style. Designed by an all-star cast that included Lee Laurie, Malvina Huffman, and Janet Scudder, and Reredos designed by Earl Thurp and carved by Edward Ardolino. However, like St. Bart's, the sculptural program suffered from significant cash flow problems. During the late 20s, more and more elements were cut until the Great Depression shut all work down entirely. Nearly two-thirds of the planned designs were not realized. Heavenly Rest is also notable for its stained glass windows. Designed by Whitefriars of London, the same firm that designed the windows of St. Thomas, they benefit from Miss Carnegie's stipulations and are fully illuminated by the sun. The windows came close to being destroyed, however. In 1993, a 3-alarm fire broke out at the church, which burned at nearly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit and claimed the organ console, choir stalls, woodwork, and arches on the south side. A very clever ventilation strategy by the fire department pulled the air out of the building and saved the windows from being blown out. Now, finally, we arrive at one of the most momentous events in both Episcopalian and New York history, the commissioning of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. While discussion of a cathedral had been talked about as early as 1928 with the proposal for the building on Washington Square, serious discussion did not get underway until the 1870s, when the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral were going up. A committee for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine was formed in 1873, and a site between 57th and 59th Streets was chosen, but the financial panic of 1873 put a stop to this effort. Finally, on June the 1st, 1887, Bishop Henry Codman Potter wrote his Letter to the Citizens of New York, an eloquent text that highlighted his vision for the cathedral to be a monument for all New Yorkers. However, this kicked off the first of many problems that would plague the cathedral. Bishop Potter's letter, while ecumenically minded, created the impression that St. John the Divine would be interdenominational, a grave mistake. Donations poured in for the new church, many from non-Episcopalians, and the church began looking for a site. The highest point on the outcropping of Morningside Drive in 116th Street was the first pick, but savvy owners learned about the interest in their land, and the pricing quickly rose beyond what the Cathedral Committee could pay. Ultimately, they picked a 13-acre plot on Amsterdam and 110th Street, where the cathedral currently is today. That site went to Columbia University, who hired McKim, Mead & White to put the centerpiece of their campus on top. 3 days after purchasing the site on November 8, 1887, the Committee on Architecture was formed and populated with major Episcopalian figures, including J. Roosevelt Roosevelt, the grandfather of FDR, William Waldorf Astor, and Bishop Potter, among others. Professor William R. Ware, founder of the first and second architecture schools in America at MIT and Columbia, was selected to set up the competition. Unfortunately, Ware aside, only one person on the board actually had direct experience with architecture. The committee settled on inviting 14 prominent designers. The firms picked were a who's who of notable American architects working in every style of the time. Figures included Richard Morris Hunt, McKim, Mead & White, Carrere and Hastings, Frank Furness, and many other notable figures. The competition was also opened up to the public at large and around the world, with designs coming in from Canada, England, France, Ireland, Italy, and Scotland. Most notably, 3 designs came from the up-and-coming figures of Ralph Adams Cram, Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, and the partnership of George Hines and Grant Lafarge. The first problem in the competition came with the dates. An initial deadline of December 15, 1888 was set, but numerous requests meant that the deadline was extended 1 month to January. However, the committee only granted this extension to a portion of the competitors. Some of the people excluded learned of it anyway, while others were left in the dark. Ultimately, 68 entries were received. After several entrants objected to a public exhibition, the Architecture Committee made the competition closed, contradicting Bishop Potter's earlier promise of openness and provoking outrage. In March 1889, the trustees met and whittled the competition down to 12, including both Cram's proposal, designed with his partner at the time, Wentworth, and the Hines and Lafarge entry that would win. Almost all of the big names were eliminated. William Ware and 2 other professionals were consulted on the selections, producing an expert's report, which resulted in 4 finalists being selected, including the winner, Hines and Lafarge. All the while, reporters had been sleuthing about and had successfully identified 3 out of 4 final contestants, bar Hines and Lafarge. It was also at this point that the public realized that the cathedral would be an explicitly Episcopalian building and not an interdenominational one, stoking anger. When the announcement was made confirming the 4 finalists in May 1990, there was considerable discontent. Only one of the selections was considered by the public and possibly resentful rejectees to be qualified, that of the firm of Potter and Robertson. However, this was a problem. As it turned out, Bishop Potter was half-brother with William Appleton Potter of Potter and Robinson. Anti-corruption politics were in the air at the time, and Bishop Potter had given a sermon denouncing nepotism only 2 weeks before, for which he had been nationally popular. Thus, Bishop Potter insisted on architect Potter's disqualification. It did not happen, but the message had been received. A design exhibition of the failed selections provided mixed feedback. Criticism was muted, but generally focused on a lack of development of the designs, stating that they needed further study. Finally, a date was set for the exhibition of the 4 finalists at the National Gallery, but another delay occurred when W. Kent, one of the partners of Hines and Lafarge, sued the other 2 for not giving him proper credit. Kent was eventually bought out, but not before the American Architect and Building News declared the St. John's competition one of the most disagreeable professional events of the generation. The public exhibition had mixed results. Potter and Robertson's plan was the most well received, but it was not liked that its 4 towers replaced a central spire. Huss and Buck's English Gothic building was considered intelligent and good, but too conservative. William Halsey Wood's design, originally rendered in watercolor and dramatically titled Jerusalem the Golden, was called the most original entry by advocates and detractors alike, but would be enormously expensive and was castigated as architecturally undisciplined and unbuildable. In comparison, the criticism leveled at Hines and Lafarge's design was muted. The scale and centralized plan were applauded, and the potential for its vaults to serve as canvases for murals was appreciated, possibly to be done by Lafarge's notable father, John Lafarge, who did work for St. Thomas's Third Church. Presumably, nepotism was all right if it led to fine murals. The trustees cast their votes in secret. The minutes are not recorded. However, it is clear that specific designs, and to be more precise, specific architects, had their champions. Huss and Buck's standard Anglican cathedral won over the more conservative individuals, while William Halsey Wood's dramatic design appealed to Bishop Potter, who wanted a statement. The design by Potter and Robertson appealed to many thanks to being a sufficiently distinct but still notably English building, but Bishop Potter, who was known as a man of uncompromising directness, made sure that it did not move forward. This left Hines and Lafarge's proposal, which had an accommodating interior with a large auditorium, coupled with a Gothic enough nave that could be modified to suit their needs better. Indeed, the flexibility and non-committal nature of their styling was what appealed to the trustees, as it could be potentially pulled in one direction or the other. Finally, their scheme for a fast construction of the apse appealed to the financially conscious trustees. This resulted in their selection being the result of a compromise. Being consistently second was the greatest endorsement it could get. Unfortunately, this was a mistake in both principle and practice. The Romanesque was falling out of architectural favor, making way for the Gothic resurgence that our church would be the apogee of, and the original plan being both a Latin cross and an auditorium made little sense. Furthermore, the board had wanted Gothic anyway, even at this early stage. Hines and Lafarge were young architects, only in their early 30s, although they had impressive educations and had apprenticed with notable architects. They had only one major project to their name, the Roman Catholic Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament in Providence, Rhode Island. This lack of experience meant that they were pushed around as the building progressed, causing even more friction. These changes did not escape the press. A New York Times editorial called the building the Compromise Cathedral. The construction process was no less painful. It began in December 1892 with the cornerstone ceremony. Work did not actually commence until the following spring, when it was discovered that the soft stone was below the soil instead of bedrock. This resulted in a 3-year delay to sink concrete pilings. During this time, passers-by in the L train would only be able to see this single forlorn arch on the top of the ridge. Finally, in 1900, the main progress of the cathedral was underway, but here another problem asserted itself. The 8 monumental columns at the east end of the apse were supposed to be single pieces of stone, each 6 feet thick and with a weight of 130 tons, the largest such columns in America and the second largest in the world. However, production of these columns as a single piece proved impossible. They kept cracking on the lathe. The compromise, where they were cut into 2 sections, still proved staggeringly difficult to transport to the site. Then, erecting them was its own challenge. Special derricks made of Pacific Northwest pine had to be ordered to lift the columns into place. This was a particularly challenging aspect of the process, but was typical of the construction. Further complicating matters was the slowdown of funds. The initial hype and excitement of the cathedral had died down due to all the negative press having to do with the competition, as well as the amount of time it was taking to erect the building. Episcopalians themselves also were simply not as numerous as other denominations, who, now knowing they were not part of the project spiritually, had little interest in getting involved. Furthermore, there was a sentiment favoring smaller churches in general. All this suppressed the progress of the cathedral. Mayoral problems between the architects and the trustees of the church appeared in 1806, when it was suggested that masonry crossing arches Hines and Lafarge had selected should be replaced with reinforced concrete. The architects rejected this demand as not suitable for the cathedral, but they were on thin ice. There were significant cost overruns, and the architects had grossly overestimated how many people would be able to fit into their choir. More seriously, Hines and Lafarge had taken on multiple other commissions, including a project for a Roman Catholic cathedral in Seattle, which the trustees took as them not devoting enough attention to their own project. Things got even more complicated with the death of George Hines in 1907. With his passing, the trustees now had the contractual right to change architects. However, Lafarge was allowed to keep working on the choir and crossing. By late 1908, the choir was roofed and the installation of the Guastavino tile ceiling was begun. Finally, in April of 1911, the apse, choir, the crossing, and apsidal chapels were completed and the first dedication ceremony held. A month later, Lafarge was fired. This decision to fire Lafarge was based on many and varied problems they had had with him over the preceding years, but it was also simply because the Byzantine-styled plan was simply out of date. Episcopalian church building had had an area of experimentation thanks to H. Richardson's Trinity Church in Boston in 1877, but the pull of Gothic design, already what the trustees had wanted anyway, was back in vogue across the country and beyond. Washington Cathedral, Liverpool Cathedral, and others had all committed to Gothic designs in the past 5 years. This move caused significant press attention as the reporters went busily to work airing the latest drama. There is some evidence to suggest Cram was maneuvering to get the commission as early as 1907. However, Cram claimed he only took the commission after hearing from the trustees of the cathedral that they did not have a contract with Lafarge. Cram also made a suggestion for a design committee consisting of Lafarge, the Gothicist Henry Vaughan, and himself, and even the retaining of Lafarge as an architect with himself as consultant. These were not made in good faith, however. He knew the trustees had made their decision. Cram arrived at the scene at a point when the cathedral had no money to spend on construction. This was a blessing, as it let him develop a plan for turning what was currently pleasant into a Gothic building. 2 years later, in 1913, he presented a scheme for his new church that reflects French precedent, emphasizing height with 2 strong central towers that reference Notre Dame de Paris, as well as a complex portal scheme based on Bourges Cathedral. This strongly precedent-based Gothic represents an extremely academic and studied approach to the design, without much experimentation. Cram also set about designing the ancillary buildings of the cathedral close during this time as well. Although they are not as grand, they are compelling buildings, in particular the Synod House completed in 1913, but money was again a problem. Construction began again in May 1916, but funds ran out once more in November. After that, the First World War ensured no work would happen on the building until the 1920s. In 1925, Franklin D. Roosevelt hosted a rally at Madison Square Garden to support the cathedral. Unfortunately, an old conflict resurrected itself, the question of whether the cathedral would be non-denominational or Episcopalian, prompted by the then Bishop William T. Manning commenting that the cathedral would be a shrine of prayer and worship for all people. John D. Rockefeller, a devout Baptist, heard this, donated $500,000, and requested a seat on the board. He was refused and promptly funded the construction of Riverside Church on the other side of Morningside Heights. The building rose through the 1930s, interestingly being pursued through the Great Depression. Bishop Manning successfully argued that it kept hundreds of craftsmen and laborers employed, supporting their families. The nave and west facade were completed and dedicated in 1941, only 7 days before Pearl Harbor. The war was the end of serious construction on the cathedral. After it was over, a brief plea for funds was raised by Bishop Manning, but quickly was redirected to the reconstruction of Episcopal missions destroyed in the war. Much later, in the 1980s, there was an effort by Dean James Morton to create a stoneworking program for the local community that would realize Cram's towers on the facade, but build a contemporary greenhouse-esque design by the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava along the transept and spire. However, funds once again ran out and the project was shelved for good. Ironically, it was also at this time that the cathedral made the decision to allow non-Episcopalians on the board. For all of the previous generation's bluster, the cathedral became a multi-faith project anyway, only without the financial resources the building all had hoped for. The cathedral ended its current construction plans with a holding pattern, hiring the firm of Polshek and Partners, now Ennead Architects, to restore, repair, and waterproof the existing buildings, shelving any serious work. Currently, the cathedral administration has pushed back on the idea of adding to the building, citing the need to support social programs. It will be up to future generations to decide whether to complete St. John the Divine. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Cole, for that incredibly informative presentation, which only confirmed my original belief that behind every beautiful building is an Episcopalian. So, with that said, I believe we do have about maybe 5 minutes that we could spend on questions, if anyone has a quick one. I would just ask if you keep it brief to allow maybe multiple people to ask questions. So I will come if anyone has a question. Ruth, yes.
St. Paul, that building, someone said that across on 60th Street and the Park Avenue, the Christ Church is the same constructor, same designer or whatever. Is that true?
Christ Church and what?
On the corner of 60 and Park.
Corner of 60 and Park. I'm not certain. I think that's a Presbyterian building. I think that's actually by Ralph Adams Cram.
I don't know, but somebody said that, and then the building inside is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It is, they have a lot of Greek, decor inside.
Well, it's possible to look this up if you look at the Landmark Preservation Commission's website, where you can find a map of New York and identify all sorts of buildings. A resource I highly recommend to anybody who wants to learn about any historic buildings in New York.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You briefly mentioned,
Hold on, Stuart, if you just speak into the mic so people on the live stream.
you briefly mentioned for the original cathedral, what was that site? It was on Fifth Avenue, you said? And
So the original site of, do you mean the original proposed site or the site that
the original proposal site
in the 1870s?
Right.
Let me see again.
You mentioned something about Fifth Avenue.
It was 59th, and let me look it up. Yes, 57th and 59th Street. I would have to do more research to figure out where exactly that would be, but again, the financial panic meant that it never even got beyond the exploratory stage.
So it would have been on the east side because the Vanderbilt mansion was there, right? I mean,
It could have been. I don't want to say, just purely speculate, but what I will say, a lot of the motivation, even at that point, was St. Patrick's. The Episcopalian establishment was always jealous of St. Patrick's once they saw it, and they said they had to have another one. And indeed, part of what prompted the building campaigns getting going again in the 1880s was the fact that St. Patrick's was adding spires as well. So there was that was sort of the social dynamic of the time.
Thank you. So just so we can all get to Mass on time, I think we'll leave it there. But a huge round of applause again to Cole. Thank you very much. Great job.
Thank you.
That was
Thank
really,
you so much.
Really informative.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm assuming you're trying to get to the.
I'll get to Mass eventually, but no.
I'm an architectural historian and a
Oh.
practicing Episcopalian.
Wonderful.
I live in D.C., but I'm debating